pocket. There we go. All right. I can hear me pretty well through the mask, so that's good. Hopefully it won't reverb at all. So I apologize first off today. I have a pretty interesting and exciting sinus infection. I checked 4 times. It's not COVID. It's just a sinus infection, but it is pretty nasty. Sorry, it's going to be an interesting setup, I think. Okay.
Yeah. Meaning pilot stuff.
Actually, that might be helpful. If you can control this one, I'll control this one.
Come over here.
I'll try to tell you next slide. Here's the mouse. Okay. Thank you for coming today. My name is Lexy, and I am the founder of Ursa Mayhem Media and the lead developer of our first title, Here There Be Bears, a story about post-traumatic stress disorder. So when I was 11 years old, I broke my femur in half when I skied into this sun deck, right there, kind of small looking in this picture, and broke my femur in half when I was 11. I did pretty much everything you could do wrong. I wasn't wearing a helmet. I wasn't skiing with a buddy. It was nighttime. And I told my mother I was going on a different trail than I actually went on. So when I say everything, I mean everything. Here's like a slightly better look at it. One thing to note, when this was originally there in 2004, this is from 2016, this front part had the same height as the back walls. So it was all really blocked off and closed in. You really couldn't see anything because those walls were much taller.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. You're just skipping ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I clicked it.
Nice little preview. This was back in 2004 when children didn't really have any access to cell phones and technology. So I was really stranded on this mountain by myself. To this day, I do not know how long I was on this, underneath that bench on that sun deck calling for help. It could have been 5 minutes. It might have been 5 hours. From what I found out from my mother later, it was probably around 2 hours, but I have such bad time dilation, I actually don't know. Like time was kind of meaningless at the time. I don't even know if I blacked out, but I was young and springy, pretty rough and tumble. I was 11, and within 6 hours of surgery, I was up and walking around. And within 6 months, I was walking without the help of crutches again. That's not to say that I was healed, though. At the same time, my behavior at school, when I was this lovely little 6th grader you see before you, became erratic. Though not enough that anybody ever did anything about it. I avoided anybody who was sick, and by avoided, I mean like if somebody threw up in a bathroom, I would avoid that bathroom for months. Actual months. I freaked out when I was in dark movie theaters or fainted under bright lights during choral concerts. I shut down when I was left by myself, but I wasn't actually diagnosed with PTSD until I was 21 years old. Some of the symptoms still don't make sense. Like, how do you explain to someone why you jump into fight or flight mode when somebody throws up near you, when it has absolutely nothing to do with the story of your trauma? It doesn't make sense. Post-traumatic stress disorder is generally thought of as a problem affecting veterans of combat trauma, not something that can affect anybody at any time for reasons as varied as sexual assault, natural disasters, and car accidents. I didn't know I had PTSD for 10 years. And I couldn't explain to people why I was reacting to things the way that I did. Now, one thing that I don't react to at all is visualizations of skiing and snowboarding accidents. So as I'm lying in the hospital, little 11-year-old, big blue eyes, tiny, I gaze up at my mother and I ask her for a GameCube. And she said yes. The first game that I wanted to play, without even thinking about it, was SSX3. I played this game religiously. And for those who don't know, and can't tell from this very beautiful GIF I have found on the internet, it's a game about snowboarding, where people have massive accidents, fall all over the place, get hurt on screen all the time with very little repercussions. And while I still don't like snow or ice or cold, I think that has more to do with being a lifelong New Englander than anything to do with my actual accident. Now, I don't want to insinuate here that I was cured by EA's biggest winter sports title. I did also have a few other things that I did in the aftermath as well. First, I went to weekly talk therapy sessions and was given a few prescriptions for anxiety medication. Remember, I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD at this point. So really all they thought I had was a generalized anxiety that they couldn't explain because I had such volatile reactions to very specific triggers. But at no point did anybody think to themselves, this might be trauma. Now, there are some issues with the reasons that like the diagnosis of generalized anxiety. One, in order for weekly talk therapy to be effective, you need to have a deep personal connection with your therapist, which me as an 11-year-old girl did not have with the 45-year-old white man in front of me who was trying to lead me through anxiety. Didn't really work. Second, in terms of PTSD, only 1/3 of patients see a sustained improvement over a long period of time, and few fully recover with just talk therapy. They can find therapy and talking about PTSD so overwhelming that it can cause you to actually go into a traumatic response right there in the therapy office if done incorrectly, which again, not being diagnosed correctly was a huge problem. Additionally, when you have these sort of events, you can only either focus on your logical narrative, which is what I've actually been telling you this whole time is my logical narrative of what's happened to me, or you can feel the emotions that go along with it. You actually can't really do both at the same time. This is called a dual system of awareness. So you can either tell that logical narrative or feel those feelings. The autobiographical self keeps track of yourself across time. It creates connections to people and assembles your experiences into a coherent narrative story. This is all very linear. It's a very linear process. Moment-to-moment self-awareness, however, keeps track of yourself at the present moment in time and is based in physical sensations. How are you feeling at this exact moment and what's happening to you at this exact time? And it's how we experience things in an embodied format like you would in a video game. Now, the trick in terms of therapy is aligning your autobiographical self with your moment-to-moment self. And that becomes very challenging. However, there are limits to these languages. Like I said, talk therapy didn't really help me very much. Stories ignore the fact that trauma radically changes people. Okay, let's talk medication. And I want to preface this by saying you should always take the medicines prescribed by your doctor. Nobody is saying not to do that here. What I will say is that within the medical field, especially in psychology, there tends to be this idea that pills are a solve-all, cure-all, fix-all problem solver. And they are not. People tend to think of something like, let's find a pill for a magical cure for something like PTSD, which is virtually impossible because there's so many varied reasons for post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's also so many ways and it can be handled. Many PTSD-based drugs work like alcohol and numb your feelings, leaving patients lethargic. They also have very high addiction potential, which is very problematic as well because it can lead to substance abuse, which is the leading comorbidity for people with PTSD. And because of this, I was actually told not to take my medication unless I absolutely needed to. They told me, because they gave me, I think it was like Xanax, they gave me a couple different things, and they told me, do not take this unless you really need to. So because I was 11 and nervous, I never took it. I think I still have the bottle somewhere at my house, and it's completely full. Maybe I've used like 2 in the span of like 15 years. Those prescription labs probably should get rid of those, but that's beside the point. Many organizations, especially the Veterans Affairs Office, look at pills as this instant cure, and that's what's one of the big problems right now. Because many pills even interfere with the processing of your trauma because they numb the pain and they numb the feelings to it. Medication can be incredibly beneficial for treating symptoms, however, and like I said, if your doctor's prescribing you medication, you should take it. But there are issues with it in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I just wanted to show you the list of symptoms. I'm not going to read them all, that would take forever. But this is all the list of symptoms that I could think of. Now, I don't experience all of these symptoms, and other people with PTSD also do not experience every single one of these symptoms. It's a very variable disorder. But because no one's experience with PTSD is universal. People may experience some of these symptoms. Others experience all of them, but at varying degrees. And then there are also things like comorbidities like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia that can go alongside these as well, depending on genetics and type of trauma, so your predispositions. So let's talk media, because this is what this is supposed to be about. Most media shows PTSD from an outside perspective. You don't really see into the characters' heads. You only see them in their volatile reactions to the trauma they're experiencing, not what is making them have those reactions in the first place. Probably the best example of this style is the 2009 film Brothers, which when I was doing my research was the first film that popped up when I said, films about PTSD. Tobey Maguire's character is captured by a nameless Middle Eastern terrorist group and forced to kill his comrade to survive. He then returns home to his wife and brother, where they have started a semi-relationship and sort of freaks out over the whole thing. Now, we see exactly one scene in this whole movie from Tobey Maguire's perspective once he returns home. And it's a scene at a birthday party where they use sound design to show an overwhelming feeling that causes him to freak out at his daughter at her birthday party. And everybody is stunned. And then the rest of the movie is spent watching him get slowly more deranged until he almost murders his whole family. And you don't see it from his perspective. You only see it from the outside, which is very scary and othering. Now, this is problematic because what has become expected. This is problematic because it's what's become expected. That people with PTSD, who are almost always depicted as veterans, become violent when triggered. Now, according to ptsd.va.gov, 7% of people with PTSD in the US population have a proclivity to violence. Even among post 9/11 veterans, which is the group with the highest rate of these violent outbursts, it's shown to still be under 20%. High, but still not the majority of even veterans. But this is sort of the narrative that keeps getting pushed, is that they're going to be perpetrators of violence. This follows another common misconception about PTSD, that it is for veterans. PTSD is associated with combat vets because it was named during the Vietnam War or post-Vietnam War era in 1980 when it was added to the DSM-3, because all these studies are being done on veterans coming back from Vietnam. Now, war has had names for this in the past. They called it shell shock, they've called it combat fatigue, war neurosis, all these other things. And the public was first really introduced to this through shows like MASH. Now, MASH has a very interesting experience with PTSD because it existed both before and after the addition of PTSD to the DSM-3. Its early season episodes are very othering. They have people going through shell shock and combat fatigue, and they're very like otherized, and nobody really says it makes sense. And they're like, prescription is just buck up, kiddo, we'll send you back to the front and that'll help you get better. Didn't work. The last episode of the whole series, which this show ran for 11 years, is a 2-hour exploration of the main character Hawkeye's experience with PTSD. And it's the first time PTSD was actually shown on screen from the inside viewpoint of someone with the disorder. That's still not the norm, however. I just wanted to show some statistics provided by PTSD UK that estimate that 7% of military personnel on average develop PTSD. 6% of all people globally will actually develop PTSD within their lifetime. And the statistic is higher in women at 8% and lower in men at just about 4%. Studies suggest the leading causes of PTSD are actually rape and sexual assault, as well as domestic violence, not wartime combat. And these numbers include only diagnosed people only, which is where I'm going with this. Now, more recent media has begun to show the emotional process behind PTSD, viewing the main character's experience in these in trauma and showing how these experiences get started. Now, these are relatively recent, and you'll notice a lot of them are alternative forms of media. They're still not like films that everybody sees all the time. They're not necessarily television that everybody's going to watch. It's still much more of a niche group, even though you guys may recognize a lot of these titles. These examples are humanizing PTSD in a way that hasn't been done as much in the past and is very helpful. Sorry. It is very helpful in terms of giving people more insight into how PTSD is experienced. So I was challenged with two important pitfalls to look at because I decided the best way to add my own narrative to this was through a video game. My first pitfall, how do you make a game for PTSD, for people without PTSD, that will give them the experience when PTSD is both a very specific and based heavily on the context of your traumatic event? Take, for instance, our game being set in a cave. Now, unless you have cave-related trauma, or maybe you have claustrophobia, or something else that would make you uncomfortable in a cave, if you go into a VR environment and just look around a cave, there's a strong chance that you're just going to be like, this is really pretty, this is really neat, I'm in a new space. And that was one of the biggest hurdles that we had to overcome early in the process. I know, Ken, you were there. I know we talked about it and debated about it a bit. In reality, what the result would be would probably look like a haunted cave if I didn't have any sort of context. Things would sort of happen, and it might be spooky, and it might be a horror game, but it wouldn't really be PTSD so much as just a horror, like a haunted cave experience. Additionally, my second hurdle to overcome was what Lisa Nakamura calls identity tourism in her paper, Race In for Cyberspace. Now, the basic idea of her paper is that the digital sphere allows for people to put on any persona they want, take any identity. They could become Black, they could become Hispanic, they could become disabled, they could become LGBT. And at the end of the day, when they're done being online, they can just take it off and go home, which minority groups cannot do. So this was a big issue in terms of looking at media that shows identity as a major component of the gameplay. Because it also allows people to play into these harmful stereotypes and do tasks that may not be how the marginalized experience their world. Essentially, they're able to log off and shed their skin. To combat both of these issues, I decided to focus on creating an interactive narrative about a character with a very specific traumatic experience that I could relate to, but personally wouldn't be as triggered by. Notice this is set in a cave and not on a mountaintop where you're stuck and can't move. So now that we're finally getting to the meat of it, Here There Be Bears is an interactive media project, part film, part escape room, and part virtual reality video game that immerses the player in the experience of post-traumatic stress disorder. Here, trauma is the bear, lurking somewhere in the cave shadows, seen only in shadow and heard only in echoes. Those with trauma must learn how to deal with their own personal bear by either running from it, hiding from it, confronting it, or being consumed by it. Set in the dark labyrinth of the mind of the protagonist, Sam, the player follows the fragmented memories of the caving accident that left her with residual trauma years later. In the midst of her panic, a mysterious voice starts emanating from her phone and begins to urge her to push through and break out of the cave. Now, even after making it back to reality several times, new triggers and temptations keep her revisiting the shards of traumatic memory. And slowly, the player will approach the shameful secret surrounding Sam's accident and will come to discover the nature of the voice on the phone. Now, the ultimate goal is escape, but the player will need to balance their desire to escape with their desire to find out more information and discover the root cause of the trauma. Now, as the longer you spend in the cave system, the harder it will be to actually get out. So there's multiple ways to get out. There are multiple endings, but the longer you stay in, the harder it is to get out. There's actually a way to get out within the first 5 minutes, but you probably won't be able to find it until you've played through the game at least once. I'm not going to tell you what it is, though. You can double click, honestly, because now I am bringing my own voice, both metaphorically and literally, to Here There Be Bears as the culmination of my fine arts degree at UConn. Oh, sorry. Sam's story is my story, and with 10 years of voice acting experience, I will be lending both my personal knowledge of PTSD as well as my acting training to navigate Sam's mental landscape. Now, at its most, so you may be wondering at this point, how does this really relate to trauma? It has to do with Sam's trauma response during her flashback. For those of you who aren't aware what a trauma response is, though, this can be somewhat of a confusing concept. Now, at its most fundamental level, a trauma response is your brain's way of protecting itself during a traumatic event, and it occurs thanks to the vagus nerve that flows down the back of your spinal column. Now, according to polyvagal theory, this slow descend down, you can click it, sorry. This slow descent down the vagal nerve is depicted in the game through one of the secondary characters. Beginning, sorry, I wish I had a drink. Okay. Now let's start with the 3 levels of the polyvagus system, all a part of the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for our arousal and fight or flight sensations. At level 1, we talk about social engagement. This is how we all sort of stand on a day-to-day basis. That's where we're all kind of at right now. This is our super ego brain, the part of us that makes us people. Now, this is where we look for social cues like smiling and waving, support and engagement with others, and it's characterized by a slow heart rate and low breath, unless you're me and you currently have a sinus infection, in which case it's categorized by being a little miserable. It's fine. When level 1 comes into a threat, it starts by calling out for help, which I did over and over and over and over and over again for 2.5 hours when I was on that mountain. It also seeks comfort from anybody who happens to be nearby, which may be why when you have a stressful situation, you look to somebody else for confirmation or just, acknowledgement of the problem. Now, if none arrives, this is where we start moving into more primitive modes of survival. This brings us to level 2, which is our mammalian brain, our fight or flight response. The sympathetic nervous system activates the muscles and nerves, and the heart rate increases. Our voice actually changes and gets higher pitched as this happens, so we begin to sweat. This is where we start either trying to fight something or run from something. However, there are times when fight or flight is not a possibility, like, say, being trapped in a cave or with a broken leg on a mountain. In this instance, we move into the 3rd level. The dorsal vagal complex takes over and we plunge into what is referred to as reptilian brain. This goes into the organs that are below the diaphragm. This talks about your stomach, your kidneys, your intestines. Thank you very much. Your stomach, kidneys, intestines, and stops all the processes. It also creates massive gastrointestinal distress. That you even, once you get further down that vagal nerve, may even become very hard to feel. This also maybe explains why I get freaked out and start having a panic attack when somebody throws up, because I'm relating it to that trauma response. That's just a theory, though. I've been working with a psychiatry professor, though. When you get into this reptilian brain, it reduces your metabolism, it plunges your heart rate and creates loss of breath. Your awareness begins to shut down and you start to not be able to feel pain. This is a catatonic state. That is why it exists. It's actually trying to reserve all of your energy and all of your resources for the only object of staying alive. Now, these panic symptoms maintain themselves as people develop a fear of these bodily functions that are associated with this, which, like I said, probably why I really get freaked out by vomit. I think, yeah, this is a good idea. Ooh. Now, it's hard to remember when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder that at its core, a trauma response exists to save your life. Post-traumatic stress disorder occurs when the trauma response happens at the wrong time, disrupting your daily life. So it's actually doing its job. It's just doing its job at the wrong time. So I mentioned the secondary character that really represents this descent through the polyvagal system. That character is Austin, who's played by Jordan Lindley, who is going to be one of our co-composers on the project. That song is sounding great, by the way. If I could show it to you, I would. Austin is the voice on Sam's phone and moves through these different phases verbally and how he directs Sam on the phone. He becomes her lifeline in the caves. Additionally, the song that Jordan is singing at the beginning of the game is actually the main responsible trigger for Sam when she gets into the caves initially, because it is the only song she had on her phone when she was in the caves. So when it starts playing in her bedroom at night, that's when she starts getting triggered. That's how she gets into this flashback nightmare that she starts to experience, is through this audio. Because this is the only thing she had downloaded when she got tracked. Now, keep in mind, this is all set in a cave. If you've ever been down in a cave or in the basement of like a skyscraper, you will know caves don't have cell phone service, which is why the only song she was able to listen to in that cave system was the one on her phone. And she played it on repeat because for 2 days there was nothing for her to do other than call for help or listen to the phone. Now, Sam's relationship with Austin is a bit of a mystery that you'll have to play through the game and dive deeper into the traumatic mystery to find out. But for the most part, he acts as a guide through the darkness as well as a lifeline in your caves. And he has the added benefit of acting as a guide literally for the player when they do not know what to do at a certain point in the game. You can always follow Austin's advice to get to an ending. And that's how I will phrase that. The other secondary characters in the game, Shay, Bobby, and Sam's mom, explore various reactions to Sam's trauma from other perspectives, as well as how relationships can change over the course of time when you have PTSD. The goal of these characters isn't to vilify any one person for how they respond, but to show the strains on relationships that trauma can cause. These scenes appear primarily as collectible fragments that you can find throughout the levels that activate automatically and play an audio log while you're moving through the environment. Midge Scully is playing both our secondary lead, Shay, and acting as the 2D artist and PR person. Shay is Sam's best friend and appears in the intro of the game as well as in the various little shards of memory scattered throughout. Thomas Riley is playing Robbie, a friend of Shay and Austin who doesn't take life too seriously and likes to smooth things over. And Julia Urick is playing Sam's mom, a woman who is both cares for Sam deeply, but also has no idea how to handle Sam's emotional trauma responses. Important to note, not all people who experience a traumatic event will get PTSD. PTSD is rooted in this concept of shame or being complicit in one's own trauma. There's actually a lack of agency when the trauma originally occurs that leaves the victim of trauma feeling that they could have done something more or something different that would have changed the outcome and stopped them from getting traumatized in the first place. Many find it incredibly difficult to tell other people what this shameful secret is and create cover stories to make themselves feel like they sound better. Now, that's not to say that the big secret is big or daunting or deep or dark. It's just something that you don't tell anybody. And because it's at the very root and core of the trauma, it makes you feel like what you've done is your own fault and not the fault of outside forces. For example, until I was 22, I told everybody that when I was skiing, I lost control, hit a patch of ice, and accidentally crashed into a bench. But that's not what happened. What actually happened is that I didn't lose control at all. And I'm just checking to see if I wrote this. Yeah, okay. What actually happened, probably 5 more minutes would be nice. What actually happened is that I had been seeing some snowboarders doing tricks on those stairs about a week previously. And I thought, since I was a very talented skier at 11, that I would be very, very, very cool and do the exact same kinds of tricks that they were doing that I saw them do all the time. So I went to the top of the mountain, skied down at about 45 miles an hour, did a jump up those stairs, landed, which I was like, that moment when I landed, I was like, I did it, I nailed it, and then realized I had about 15 feet to stop. And that's what happened. But I didn't tell anybody that because when you're 11, you don't want to say, oh, I tried to do something stupid and I got myself seriously injured. You say, I was 11 and I lost control of my skis and I didn't know what happened. That's why at the core of this game, I've actually written in the truth behind Sam's cover story of how she got into this caving accident. And it's a secret that she's not verbalized out loud. That said, you can actually finish the game without ever finding out what the secret is in order to get out of your trauma response. The balance of the game is this desire for self-discovery and understanding, even if it harms you, and that need to escape the memory-driven nightmare that is Sam's mind. For Sam's story, we sought to include a variety of symptoms that I've experienced. I didn't want to try to delve too deeply into things I haven't experienced just because I thought, given that we only have about 5 people on our whole team, and I'm the main person writing and directing and arting the whole thing, I wanted to keep it as limited as possible. I didn't want to delve into too many things. I've clearly done a decent amount of research on this already, but I didn't want to try to go out of my scope. Some of these are going to be fairly obvious. The game is set inside a nightmare with ambiguous psychosis elements. Others are scripted in a little more subtly. Something that takes the player an hour might only take 1 minute based on the alarm clock on Sam's bedside table. Some things are implied within the context of the script and how characters respond to Sam. And other things like physical reactions to PTSD, I'm actually looking into developing haptic feedbacks that actually feed into some of these like trembling, vibrations, shaking, things like that. So you can feel some of these feelings because that'll be the hardest to replicate. Now, the primary game mechanic of the game is the loop and looping itself. As the player moves through the environment, subtle changes will appear, and set in 3 primary locations, the story will be told through these subtle changes. These environments will then change just very slightly each time the character passes through, the player passes through them. And you can only escape the loop by either quitting the game completely or by breaking through the wall of the cave itself. Along the way, the player will find new ways to interact with the environment and play different mini games and micro games using their phone, which is the primary source of your mechanics. Austin may ask the player to perform the same task over and over in this iterative sense, even after the player no longer needs to do so to move on to the next section. Many with PTSD suffer from repeating patterns of behavior and repeated actions. For example, when I was in college, one of the big things that used to happen to me all the time is when I was starting to have a panic attack or I felt sick, I would try to call my boyfriend. And if he didn't pick up, because it was 3 a.m, I would try calling him again in case he just hadn't heard it. And then I'd try calling him again because maybe he was just reaching for his phone. And then I'd call him again because, 3 times the charm, 4th time's the charm, whatever. And then I'd call him again because he would pick up at some point, right? And then I'd call him again. And then at about 7 a.m, he would look at his phone and he'd have about 48 missed calls for me. Because it becomes so iterative. The fear actually comes from when the cycle stops and what happens after the cycle stops. And the reason the cycle would stop is that my phone would die. I would be having a forced stop to that repeated action. Now, slowly, the players should theoretically learn that they don't have to follow the loop and that they're able to break out of it. But this isn't going to be something that's obvious to the player until they get late in the game. Every area of this game has been devised to accentuate the aggressive iteration that those who suffer from PTSD go through. And every portion of the project is designed to accentuate this aesthetically, metaphorically, and physically. Everyone's taking a good drink. Water is very helpful, thank you. Now, iteration is very key here. Even during flashbacks that people have in real life, no re-experiencing of your trauma is ever exactly the same. So it's iteration and not direct copies that are the key to the game. The trauma can even build on itself. And when trauma is relived without guidance, it tends to become more traumatizing and can actually traumatize you more and in new different ways. So you get more and new symptoms. Very exciting, very fun. Now, while studies have yet to be conducted on the broad range of the population, there's currently an overwhelming amount of anecdotal evidence that suggests that therapies with physical components, such as theater therapy, self-defense classes, etc., deliver a sense of agency to trauma survivors and are extremely effective in helping curb PTSD. Theater therapy allows for people to explore difficult emotions in a safe setting, and self-defense classes are very popular with sexual assault survivors for regaining a sense of their bodies and safety. One study that worked with self-identified gamers who were also veterans in the Iraq War who had PTSD said that playing first-person shooter games actually helped them make their time in combat feel less real and their time in the civilian world feel like real life again, which is actually the opposite of what most combat veterans experience when they come back to the United States. The working theory behind why these agency-driven activities provide relief and reintegration of trauma is that these activities act like a new iteration of the trauma, however, ones that allow survivors to change how these events play out. So someone who got mugged may be able to experience what it's like to safely disarm somebody and get away, helping them reorganize how they experience their trauma. Sorry. To that end, Games can be iterations on a traumatic event with very low risk. If you fail, just try again. I think we're running low on time, so I don't have to go into the mechanics too deeply, unless you guys want me to keep going. I'll keep going, okay. Now, all mechanics, as I said earlier, are isolated to the cell phone and a single trigger button on your other hand. This is the one mechanic that's still in early phases of development. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, but it's a micro game that's available to you at any time that promotes breathing and meditative breathing. This is one of the few things that I've learned in therapy that I still use. It's just square breathing in order to retain your breath and stop these heightened emotions and heightened arousal symptoms from happening. But it's based on square breathing. It's going to be some kind of rhythm game involving button presses and holding. You would either, or I take it back, or from what Ken has said, possibly using actual breath as the mechanic through the VR system. Now, since I want to have a 3D release of this as well, not just VR, I will probably have to come up with a second type of game for this where you do have these button pressings, but this one is still very much in development. But this will be able to be something that anybody can initiate in the game at any time, and it'll actually tone down some of the other symptoms that are happening in the game. So if things are getting to be too overwhelming, you can use the breathing game and it'll relieve some of those overwhelming environmental aspects. Very important to keep in mind as you keep going in the game and get further and further. The second game involves using the phone flashlight. You can cast shadows on the wall using the phone's flashlight as it moves past rock structures that look very abstract. And when you get it at the right angle, it'll create an image on the opposite wall, which will be where a fragmented memory audio will start to play. And you'll be able to hear what happens. Now, this example just has a bear because I thought it would be cute. But these will be 2D renderings of actual scene depictions that'll have like one moment captured in them. Your goal will be to walk around the object until the shadow on the wall forms. Some of them will be on the ceiling, some will be on the floor, some will be on the walls. And these, I already said that. Okay, I jumped ahead. So we're gonna move on to the next mechanic. On your next iteration through the cave, you will still be able to do these light games that'll trigger memories, but we do have a new game as well. It is a camera-based game. It's actually developed around grounding practices used by people who have psychosis. The way that works is someone who has having a psychotic event can look at their phone and see what's really in front of them. Say they're seeing like a hallucination or something. They can actually check to see if that's real by looking through their phones. This is a real grounding technique that's used by people who have psychosis. In this game, people will be able to look around the cave with their phone and they will see the real bedroom environment, not the cave that they're actually standing in. Elements in the room will bear a resemblance to items in the cave. So you might have a big, large rock that kind of looks like it's shaped like a bed. And when you look at it through the phone, you'll actually see that it is, in fact, a bed. They will then take pictures of those elements, and those corresponding elements will bring themselves into the cave. So you take that picture of the bed on your phone, all of a sudden, instead of having that big rock there, you'll have the bed. This way the player can slowly build Sam's bedroom back around her and make it out of the cave system. And you can build your way back piece by piece. This is just an example of what it would look like. You have this lichen on this wall that kind of just looks like nothing. When you look at it in the phone, you'll look over and you'll see there's this poster of Marilyn Monroe. When you click your button, it'll flush and this will be replaced by the poster. And that's one of the ways that we're going to bring the cave, we're going to bring the bedroom into the cave. The last major puzzle in the cave is a Simon Says Like audio game. Players will see structures in the environment that mimic real-world objects once again, but they are going to account for Sam's daily routine, a faucet turning on, an alarm clock going off, a coffee bubbler, etc. Each will then have its own sound attached to it that the player must first turn on and then off in the correct order. The game will disrupt these activities with large audio glitches and become essentially unplayable on purpose. However, being able to complete the game correctly is not necessary for continuing on with the story. Players will be reminded that they have the ability to calm themselves during these moments with their breathing. That'll take away some of these environmental factors that are making it harder to play the game. So I just want to reiterate, the goal of this specific project is not to fix PTSD. That would be an unethical stance to take as somebody who doesn't have a doctorate in psychology or psychiatry. I am working, however, with people in the psychiatry department on the project. Here There Be Bears is an art piece about residual trauma with some common practices incorporated into the game, alongside resources for people to use to seek help later. Our game's narrative, which focuses on simple PTSD brought on by a single accident, is relatively speaking a safe, embodied experience with triggers specific to the characters in the narrative. We tried to minimize the amount of people that would be triggered by this game, so people could play it. That said, players will be reminded that they can leave at any time throughout the game, that they can use the breathing exercises if things get too overwhelming. Content warnings will be shown at the beginning of the game and each time the player restarts it to remind them of these facts. We are also planning on using a pre and post survey in order to establish what the players come into the game knowing about PTSD and what they leave knowing about PTSD. Additionally, this could help those who identify with the game seek out professional help and get recommendations and resources. The game in its narrative form will act as more than just a list of symptoms you would see on a pre-diagnostic website quiz, which is currently the only other real way for someone who doesn't have any resources to figure out if they might have this issue. But it will also provide empathy and awareness to the issue to a wider and younger audience. And then I do have, I think we need another one. I think I forgot to tell you the last one. I believe I have a little video of the current demo, which has some of the music in it. Doesn't, it might not be playing yet. Oh no, it's fine. So as a reminder, this is still in gray box, so it doesn't look like much yet.